Joining us now is Fred Fleitz, the managing editor of Lignet.com, which is a global intelligence service. Boy, do we really need your services today, Fred. Egypt is in turmoil. Obviously, you're following the news there closely. What are the latest developments?
It sure looks terrible, John, and welcome to Newsmax TV. This situation looks like there's no easy solution, and I'm afraid American policy has made it a lot worse. It's now clear that the Muslim Brotherhood, the radical Islamists in Egypt, are not going to back down. The Egyptian military government is not going to bend either. And I think we're going to have a fight to the death of one of these two sides. The Egyptian military is going to continue their crackdown. And I think that the way things are going right now, the Muslim Brotherhood is moving towards becoming an underground militancy, which is going to be engaged in acts of terrorism. It's just a terrible situation.
So we could be seeing something that might look like a guerrilla war or even a civil war down the road?
I think we're moving towards a civil war. I don't. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists have millions of supporters, and cracking down against them, there's lots of people who don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. But one thing that I think has sort of been missed in the media is that this has mostly been because the Morsi regime was so incompetent. It did try to seize more power than it was supposed to, and it did do what the people didn't want it to do. But a lot of this is economic. The country is in very bad economic shape.
And it will get even worse now if the civil war takes place.
That's right. It's going to get worse with these protests. I mean, shops can't operate if people keep filling the streets and breaking storefronts and confronting the police. It's very bad for the Egyptian economy. I'm very troubled about how the Obama administration has contributed to this. Their policy has been so weak that the Egyptian military seemed to think they had a free hand to engage in this crackdown this week. But something which I think is also worth considering, and this is something Bill Gertz said in a Washington Free Beacon piece yesterday, if the Egyptian military is willing to engage in such a ruthless crackdown that it knows will alienate the West, we have to consider the possibility that they may be preparing to make new international alliances, possibly with Moscow, in the belief that the Russians don't care about ruthless crackdowns. Look at Syria. And if that's the case, our wishy-washy policy may lead to an outcome that's much worse than we may have anticipated.
So if we have the president showing weakness in Egypt, is this another example of he deciding to lead from behind?
It seems that way, John. I think the Obama administration had a very difficult road ahead of it, and I think we all have to acknowledge that in deciding how to deal with this situation. But I don't think it was firm enough with the Morsi regime that it had to basically leave power and or initiate some pretty significant reforms to appease the people. And when the Morsi regime was overthrown, I don't think we were nearly hard enough on the military regime to make it clear that there's certain types of activities and crackdowns we simply can't tolerate.
Well, except that it was clear that the military engaged in sort of a quiet coup a month or so ago in Egypt by removing President Morsi. Now, the American law states that if you have something like that, it should jeopardize the extensive foreign aid and military aid Egypt gets. We did nothing about that. In fact, we only called off our military exercises with the Egyptians today. In your opinion, should the United States have tried to use that as leverage with either the Morsi government or with the military government now? And do we look weak by simply ignoring our own laws?
Well, I think we look very weak ignoring our laws. I think when the State Department spokeswoman is basically splitting hairs that we're not going to determine that whether this is a coup or not, I have some sympathy for the White House because Congress has tied the president's hands by requiring him to cut off aid if he determines something's a coup. Of course it's a coup. Of course it's a coup. And when we don't call things honestly, I think it undermines our reputation. We might have been able to use this as leverage. It may have been necessary for us to cut off aid in exchange for the Egyptian military making some concessions. But this situation now makes us look extremely weak.
And the military government is basically have its back up against the wall, and they feel that they can't now make concessions. Now, the Israelis, behind the scenes, they always had a strong interest in the stability of the old Mubarak regime, and they became very worried when that collapsed. How are the Israelis responding both publicly and privately to the events in Egypt?
Well, Lignit.com ran a very interesting piece on our site today about how the Israelis may be secretly assisting the Egyptian military, particularly in the Sinai. Ever since Mubarak left power, radical Islamists and Al-Qaeda members have been going to the Sinai. They're turning the peninsula into a regional terrorist haven and base of operations. And there was an attack from the Sinai shortly after Mubarak left power from Hamas members who got into Israel through the Sinai. The Israelis are very worried about this. They're worried about instability in the region. They're worried about radical Islamists getting a foothold, and they're worried about whatever whatever comes out of this government when the dust clears. It's not going to be as positive towards Israel as the Mubarak regime, and they're very worried that the result would be a regime that may not be as supportive of the Camp David Accords.
Now, there are other elements in the Middle East that are even more worrisome, perhaps, than the Muslim Brotherhood. There's Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, a whole range of groups that do not have our best interests at heart. How do you think they'll react to the events in Egypt? And will they perhaps try to make common cause with the Muslim Brotherhood and stir up trouble not only in Egypt, but elsewhere in the Middle East and perhaps even in other countries?
The first thing these people are going to do is to say, we tried democracy and it failed. And I mean, the Islamists have been suspicious of democracy for a long time.
Well, they won an election in Algeria many years ago, and they were immediately thrown out of office by the military. So they do have some precedent for, shall we say, saying that promises made in a democratic election aren't always kept.
That's right, and I think that there are some parallels to what happened in Algeria happening in Egypt. Now, many more people, I think 200,000 people were killed in Algeria when the Islamists who took power through an election were thrown out. But there are some striking parallels between what's going on in Egypt. But I think these people, the radical Islamists and Al-Qaeda, are going to portray us as hypocrites, and they're going to encourage despotic Islamic regimes to move away from the West and to move away from any semblance of democracy based on what's happening in Egypt.
So basically what you're saying is that the hopes of 2 or 3 years ago when we had the so-called Arab Spring, it now looks like it's going to be an Arab nightmare, if you can just be brief.
I think that's right. I think the hopes for the Arab Spring were a little bit exaggerated.
Well, listen, Fred Fleitz of Lignit.com, thank you. Please visit his site. And this is John Fund. I am sitting in for Steve Malzberg. And please join us in the next